The world of organized crime has always been filled with figures who walk the fine line between myth and reality. Among them, few are as iconic or as controversial as Charles Lucky Luciano. His life was a masterclass in the art of power, and his name still reverberates across the history of American criminal syndicates. But Luciano wasn't just a mob boss, he was the architect of the modern mafia. At the heart of his legacy lies a unique philosophy, one built on power, fear and silence, that guided not only his rise but also his eventual fall. Luciano's story is far more than a tale of a man who ruled a criminal empire. It is a complex narrative of ambition, betrayal, and the delicate balance between loyalty and fear. Through his life, we see the psychology of a man who knew how to manipulate people, maintain control, and yet remain a shadowy figure, even in the heights of his power. For Luciano, silence was often more powerful than words, and fear could be a more binding force than loyalty itself. His empire was founded on these elements, and it was these very same elements that would eventually lead to his downfall. But why does Luciano's story still matter today? His philosophy of power shaped not only the mafia of his time but also the criminal organizations that followed. Even now, his name carries weight, evoking images of the golden age of organized crime, a time when the streets of New York were ruled by men like him. This documentary will delve deep into Luciano's life, exploring the psychology behind his actions and decisions, and how he transformed the mafia into a well-oiled machine. We will look at his rise, the alliances and enemies he made, and how his philosophy of fear, power, and silence allowed him to hold on to control in a chaotic world. Through this journey, we'll also see the consequences of this philosophy, how it created both unshakable loyalty and devastating betrayal, how it built an empire that was ultimately too large to sustain, and how, in the end, even the most powerful figure in organized crime could not escape the law, nor the shadows of his own choices. Lucky Luciano's life is not just the story of a mob boss, it is a story of human ambition, frailty, and the complex forces that drive us toward greatness and destruction. To understand Lucky Luciano's monumental impact on the American mafia, it's essential to first explore the chaotic landscape of organized crime before he rose to power. The underworld of the early 20th century was far from the slick, well-oiled machine we often associate with the mafia today. In fact, it was a fragmented and disjointed world, rife with feuds, distrust, and constant power struggles. The term mafia itself referred more to a loosely connected collection of gangs rather than the monolithic empire it would become under Luciano's guidance. Before Luciano's vision reshaped the landscape of organized crime, the mafia in America consisted of various, often competing groups. Many of these groups were ethnically based, such as the Sicilian Mafia, Jewish gangs, and Irish mobs, each with its own code of conduct, leadership, and methods. While these groups operated in the same cities, primarily New York, Chicago, and other major hubs, they were far from unified. Instead of working together for mutual benefit, they were frequently engaged in turf wars and power struggles, each seeking dominance over the others. Violence, betrayal, and assassination were commonplace. The criminal world in the early 1900s was also defined by an intense competition for resources, particularly control over illicit activities such as gambling, bootlegging, and labor racketeering. These activities were highly profitable, but they were often marred by infighting among different factions. The lack of a central authority allowed for constant clashes between crime bosses who each believed their methods and territories should take precedence. As a result, the mafia was fragmented, with each faction trying to secure its own piece of the American underworld. The situation was unstable, dangerous, and unsustainable. At the same time, law enforcement struggled to control the surge of organized crime. The enforcement of prohibition laws, starting in 1920, created an entire underground economy, fueling the rise of bootlegging operations across the country. While these bootlegging syndicates brought in immense profits, they also made the need for order and stability more urgent. The volatile nature of the pre-Luciano Mafia was a breeding ground for discontent among those who saw potential in a more organized, professional criminal enterprise. This presented an opportunity for a figure who could offer a clear vision, a leader who would transcend the infighting and establish a system of power that could endure. Enter Luciano. Unlike his contemporaries who often relied on brute force and raw violence, Luciano recognized the need for order. He was a strategic thinker and organizer at heart. Where others saw chaos, he saw opportunity. This vision would not only redefine the mafia but also change the way organized crime functioned in the United States. Luciano understood that in order for the mafia to grow and flourish, it needed to operate like a business, efficient, hierarchical, and, most importantly, free from the constant bloodshed that had characterized its past. The fragmented world of criminal activity was no longer sustainable, and it was this realization that would lead to Luciano's rise to power. His approach wasn't just about eliminating rival gangs or securing turf, it was about consolidation. Luciano's genius was in recognizing that the competing factions within the Mafia could be united under a single umbrella, operating under a unified code of conduct that eliminated internal strife. But before he could bring order to the chaos, Luciano needed to position himself within the existing power structures. This meant gaining the trust of key players and eliminating those who stood in his way. He wasn't just building a criminal empire, he was establishing a new way of thinking about crime. It's important to note that Luciano's rise to prominence wasn't immediate. The early Mafia wasn't a world that welcomed outsiders, and many of the established leaders of the time had deep-rooted power and influence. Luciano was not born into the old-school crime families. He was an outsider in many respects, a young immigrant with little more than his ambition and street smarts to guide him. But his ability to navigate the complexities of the underworld, make connections, and bide his time would set him apart from those who were more focused on violent conquest than strategic expansion. He saw the potential to unite a fragmented criminal world into a single force that could withstand external threats and, most importantly, become a profitable and sustainable enterprise. Luciano's vision was in stark contrast to the world he was entering, a world that was messy, volatile, and unpredictable. The era before his rise was marked by power struggles, constant violence, and a lack of long-term strategy. The Mafia operated in fits and starts, driven more by individual ambition and raw power than by any overarching system. It was a world in need of a leader who could think beyond the immediate and create something more enduring. In the years that would follow, Luciano's efforts to reshape the Mafia would not only bring stability but also bring about a new era of organized crime. The world before Luciano was one of chaos, but through his brilliance he would create an empire that would stand the test of time, changing the very nature of organized crime in America forever. This transformation would lay the groundwork for his ultimate rise to power, but it would also ensure that the shadows of the criminal world would never be the same again. Lucky Luciano's journey to power began not in the corridors of wealth or political influence, but on the harsh streets of New York City, where survival was a daily struggle. Born in 1897 to Sicilian immigrant parents, Salvatore Lucania, later known as Lucky Luciano, was raised in the chaos of the Lower East Side, a neighborhood teeming with poverty, crime, and hardship. The gritty environment left a deep imprint on Luciano's psyche, shaping him into the ruthless figure he would later become. The streets were his school, and the lessons he learned there would serve as the foundation for his criminal career. From an early age, Luciano was exposed to a world of crime. His father worked long hours as a barber, while his mother struggled to keep their family afloat. The Lucania family, like many Italian immigrants at the time, lived in overcrowded tenements and faced constant economic strain. But Luciano wasn't interested in the life of a simple laborer. He was drawn to the dangerous allure of the streets, where power and respect could be gained not through hard work, but through violence, cunning, and the ability to manipulate others. The neighborhood was full of gangs, each controlling different rackets, from extortion to petty theft, and Luciano was quick to align himself with the most influential figures in the area. Luciano's early exposure to crime came in the form of small-time jobs for the local mobsters. He started as a low-level foot soldier, working as a runner for a variety of operations, from shakedowns to smuggling. It was here that he first encountered the Sicilian Mafia, an organization that was both feared and revered in the criminal underworld. Luciano was quick to learn that the Mafia was not just a group of criminals. It was a family bound by a strict code of loyalty and silence, a world where betrayal was punished with death. But despite his loyalty to his early mentors, Luciano was no ordinary street thug. He possessed a sharp mind and an instinct for power that quickly set him apart from his peers. One of the most crucial aspects of Luciano's rise was his ability to make connections. He knew how to read people, understanding that in the criminal world, alliances were just as important as enemies. Luciano's charm and intelligence allowed him to move through the ranks of the underworld, earning the trust of influential figures while remaining in the background. He was patient, biding his time and observing the weaknesses of the men around him. Luciano had the uncanny ability to play both sides, sometimes serving as a bridge between rival factions and other times positioning himself as an indispensable ally. As Luciano grew older, he became more involved in organized crime, working for some of the most powerful figures in the New York Mafia. It was during this time that he began to develop his vision for a unified Mafia, one that could operate not just as a series of isolated gangs but as a cohesive, organized enterprise. Luciano's experiences on the streets of New York shaped his understanding of the criminal world, and he realized that the key to success was control. He began to think beyond small-time rackets and focused on creating a broader network that could generate substantial profits through more sophisticated means. Luciano's climb up the criminal ladder was not without its obstacles. He encountered fierce competition from rival gangs, many of whom were led by men who had their own ambitions. But Luciano was no ordinary criminal. While others relied solely on brute force, he understood the importance of strategy and subtlety. He recognized that the best way to eliminate rivals was not through direct confrontation but through manipulation and alliances. Luciano was a master of psychological warfare, using fear and persuasion to gain the upper hand. His approach to crime was methodical and calculated, and it was clear that he wasn't interested in petty disputes. He was building an empire. One of the most defining moments of Luciano's early career came when he made his first significant alliance. During the 1920s, two Mafia factions, the Mafia and Maranzano families, were locked in a brutal war for control of New York's underworld. Luciano, who was initially aligned with the Mafia family, saw an opportunity to tip the balance in his favor. In a stunning act of betrayal, Luciano turned on his boss, Joe Mafia, and sided with Salvatore Maranzano, the leader of the rival faction. This betrayal, though risky, marked the beginning of Luciano's rise to dominance. By siding with Maranzano, Luciano not only secured his place in the Mafia but also gained the trust of one of the most powerful men in the organization. However, Luciano's loyalty was never to Maranzano. He had no intention of remaining subordinate to any single boss for long. Over the next few years, he would maneuver behind the scenes, eliminating rivals and consolidating his power. By 1931, after Maranzano's murder, Luciano was firmly in control of New York's criminal empire. His strategic alliances, coupled with his ability to eliminate his enemies without drawing too much attention, had allowed him to ascend to the top of the Mafia world. At this point, Luciano's vision began to take shape. He recognized that in order to ensure the Mafia's future, it needed to be reorganized. Luciano understood that to survive and thrive in the cutthroat world of organized crime, the Mafia needed to operate as a business. This would mean creating a structure that allowed for efficiency, reduced internal conflict, and ensured that each member of the organization could profit. Luciano's street-smart instincts told him that to avoid constant infighting, the Mafia needed to be run like a corporation, with each boss responsible for a specific territory or racket. It was this vision of unity and efficiency that would ultimately lead to the creation of the Commission, a body that would govern all Mafia activity in America and bring an unprecedented level of order to the chaotic world of organized crime. Luciano's rise from a street kid to the boss of New York's criminal underworld was a journey of both ambition and cunning. His ability to read people, form strategic alliances, and eliminate his enemies made him a force to be reckoned with. But beyond his sharp intellect, it was his deep understanding of power and the human psyche that set him apart from the other crime bosses. As a street kid, Luciano had learned that survival was about more than just strength. It was about knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to strike. This philosophy would serve him well as he moved into the next phase of his rise, where he would begin to shape the future of the Mafia in ways that no one could have predicted. Luciano's transformation from a street kid into the architect of a criminal empire was both inevitable and revolutionary. By the time he had ascended to the leadership of New York's underworld, the fragmented and chaotic Mafia that had once dominated the streets was ready for reorganization. What set Luciano apart from other crime bosses wasn't just his ability to climb the criminal ladder, but his vision for a new unified system. The Mafia, in its most traditional sense, was a collection of rival factions, each vying for control over a specific piece of the criminal pie. Luciano understood that this disorganization was not only inefficient but also dangerously unstable. He was determined to change this, not just by consolidating power but by reshaping the entire structure of the Mafia. One of the key elements in Luciano's rise to power was his ability to bring order to chaos. Before him, the Mafia was ruled by bosses, who controlled their own territories, often resulting in bloody turf wars and internal strife. Luciano realized that in order for the Mafia to grow and become more profitable, it needed a more hierarchical and systematic structure. He introduced the concept of the Commission, a board of powerful Mafia bosses from different families, each representing a specific region or racket. The Commission was not only a governing body, it was a tool for reducing infighting and resolving disputes. By establishing this unified structure, Luciano was able to create a stable platform for the Mafia to operate on, ensuring that the profits from various illegal enterprises were distributed more fairly and efficiently. Luciano's business acumen was evident in the way he organized the Mafia. Unlike many of his predecessors who had relied heavily on violence and intimidation to maintain control, Luciano recognized that criminal activities needed to be managed like a corporation. Each racket, whether it was bootlegging, gambling, labor unions, or drug trafficking, was treated as a business venture, with bosses and managers overseeing various aspects of the operation. This organizational shift meant that profits could be maximized, operations could run smoothly, and the Mafia could protect its interests more effectively. Under Luciano's leadership, the Mafia became not just a collection of criminals but a multi-layered, organized criminal syndicate with diverse investments and streamlined operations. At the heart of Luciano's empire was his ability to build alliances, both within the Mafia and beyond. One of his most important relationships was with Meyer Lansky, a brilliant Jewish-American mobster who shared Luciano's vision for organized crime as a business. Lansky's skills in money laundering and managing finances were invaluable to Luciano, and their partnership became a cornerstone of the Mafia's success. Lansky helped create a financial system that allowed the Mafia to legitimize some of its operations, thereby expanding its reach into legal industries. This move not only increased the Mafia's profits but also provided a layer of protection against law enforcement scrutiny. The Mafia was no longer just a criminal organization, it was a business empire with legitimate ties to the economy. Another critical alliance was with Frank Costello, a suave and calculating mobster who helped Luciano manage the day-to-day operations of the Mafia. Costello's ability to smooth over conflicts and negotiate with politicians and businessmen made him an essential part of Luciano's strategy. Costello's political connections played a pivotal role in protecting the Mafia from law enforcement interference, and his network helped to grease the wheels of Luciano's operations. The relationships Luciano built with key figures like Lansky and Costello provided the stability and reach the Mafia needed to flourish. They were not just allies, they were integral parts of the machine that Luciano was building. Beyond his inner circle, Luciano also understood the importance of maintaining a delicate balance of power. His leadership was based on a combination of fear, loyalty, and respect. While many of the older Mafia bosses relied on brutal tactics to assert their control, Luciano used a more measured approach. He recognized that while fear was necessary to keep subordinates in check, loyalty and mutual benefit were essential to creating a long-lasting empire. He was quick to reward those who proved themselves valuable and ruthless in eliminating those who betrayed him. His calculated decisions ensured that his empire was not just a place of fear but one where alliances were forged through mutual respect and shared profits. The expansion of Luciano's empire was not limited to New York. His vision for a national Mafia was realized as he reached out to other criminal organizations across the United States. He solidified his control over territories from Chicago to Miami, and even into the West Coast. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Luciano's reach extended beyond just the Mafia families of New York. He forged relationships with powerful figures in other crime syndicates, including the Chicago outfit and the West Coast's larger criminal groups. Luciano understood the importance of regional cooperation, and he brokered deals that ensured the smooth operation of illicit activities across the country. The Mafia's operations became a nationwide network of organized crime, stretching from the East Coast to the West Coast and beyond. A significant part of Luciano's rise to power was his involvement in Prohibition, the period during which alcohol was banned in the United States, 1920 to 1933. While Prohibition was meant to curb alcohol consumption, it instead created a massive black market that fueled the rise of organized crime. Luciano quickly saw the potential in bootlegging, where vast profits could be made by smuggling and distributing alcohol. This new market was not only incredibly profitable, but it also allowed Luciano to solidify his control over large sections of New York's criminal world. His network of bootlegging operations grew exponentially, and Luciano's ability to control the flow of alcohol during Prohibition was a key factor in his dominance. This illegal trade became one of the cornerstones of Luciano's empire, providing him with the financial resources to expand into other criminal ventures. With the money from bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering, Luciano was able to influence key figures in both the political and business world. He forged ties with influential politicians, law enforcement officials, and businessmen, creating a web of power and protection that shielded him from scrutiny. His ability to bribe and manipulate public officials allowed him to operate with relative impunity, keeping his operations running smoothly while avoiding law enforcement interference. Luciano's manipulation of both the legal and illegal systems gave him the freedom to expand his empire without facing significant opposition. Luciano's reorganization of the Mafia into a more structured and efficient operation marked the beginning of the modern era of organized crime. His ability to transform a chaotic and violent world into a profitable and professional enterprise set him apart from the crime bosses of his time. He didn't just rule with an iron fist, he ruled with intelligence, strategy, and the understanding that in the world of organized crime, survival depended not on brute force but on organization, loyalty, and the ability to adapt. His empire was not just built on the profits from illicit activities but on the foundation of a new philosophy. Organized crime could be a legitimate business, one that would thrive as long as it was run with the same principles as any successful corporation. By the early 1930s, Luciano had become the undisputed king of American organized crime. His criminal empire spanned the nation with a network of loyal allies, a vast array of profitable rackets, and a structure that allowed him to maintain control over it all. Luciano's reign marked a new chapter in the history of the Mafia, one that would influence generations of criminals who followed him. The world of organized crime would never be the same again. At the core of Lucky Luciano's success and the Mafia's ability to thrive in an unpredictable world of violence and betrayal was a set of deeply ingrained values and rules. One of the most critical of these was Omerta, the code of silence that defined the Mafia's internal structure and its relationship with the outside world. It was more than just a rule, it was a philosophy that governed loyalty, relationships, and even the very essence of what it meant to be a made man in the Mafia. Omerta represented the soul of the organization, the invisible force that kept it running smoothly and ensured its secrecy, stability, and survival. Omerta was not simply about keeping quiet in the face of law enforcement, it was a psychological contract that instilled loyalty, fear, and respect among the members. At its heart, it demanded absolute allegiance to the Mafia family and a firm commitment to protecting the organization's interests, even at the expense of personal freedom or safety. This code helped ensure that no matter the situation, a Mafia member would never betray their brothers, never speak to the authorities, and most importantly, never break the silence that kept the Mafia invisible to the world. If someone did break this sacred code, the consequences were often dire. Betrayal was met with swift and brutal punishment. The extreme form of enforcement, death, was designed to remind every member of the unspoken rule: loyalty above all else. For Luciano, Omerta was a tool that allowed him to control his empire with unprecedented precision. He understood that the success of the Mafia lay not only in its ability to make money and eliminate rivals but in its ability to maintain its secrecy. Secrecy was the lifeblood of the Mafia's power. Without it, the organization could be easily infiltrated by law enforcement, informants, or rival gangs. Luciano, a man whose own survival was often dependent on his ability to maintain secrecy, knew that Omerta was not just a principle but a system of defense. By enforcing the code, he ensured that the Mafia would remain an elusive and formidable force, one that law enforcement could not easily dismantle. The psychological weight of Omerta also created a strong bond among members. It fostered a sense of community, of belonging to something larger than oneself. In a world that was often hostile and unpredictable, the Mafia family provided a sense of security and protection. A man who adhered to the code was more than just a criminal. He was part of a brotherhood, bound by shared values and mutual trust. For many of the men in Luciano's empire, their loyalty to the family was a source of pride. They weren't just working for money or power, they were working for the organization itself, for the preservation of the code that defined their lives. This loyalty was reinforced through rituals, ceremonies, and an almost religious reverence for the family and its leaders. Every member of the Mafia understood that their role was not just about personal gain, it was about protecting the family's interests and, more importantly, protecting its secrets. While Omerta worked to unite the members of the Mafia, it also served to isolate them from the outside world. The code of silence ensured that no member of the organization would cooperate with the authorities or speak about Mafia activities. This separation from the public and from law enforcement made it difficult for outsiders to infiltrate the organization, but it also created an intense psychological dynamic within the Mafia itself. The constant threat of betrayal loomed large. If a member was suspected of speaking to the authorities or revealing Mafia secrets, their loyalty would be called into question. Even the slightest rumor of disloyalty could result in death, making it clear to everyone that there was no room for weakness. This fear of betrayal, however, also created a sense of paranoia. Loyalty was everything but trust was always precarious. Mafia families operated in a constant state of vigilance, never quite knowing who among them could be trusted completely. In Luciano's world, everyone had to prove their loyalty over and over again, even as the cost of betrayal remained ever present. Luciano's adherence to omerta went beyond simply silencing the Mafia's enemies. He understood that the code was vital to the Mafia's very survival. He instilled it as the foundation of the organization, ensuring that the principles of loyalty and silence were passed down to new generations of mobsters. The emotional and psychological pressure placed on members of the Mafia was intense. Those who were unwilling to live by the code were quickly weeded out. Those who could not maintain their silence or whose loyalty was in question were often eliminated. This ruthless enforcement of omerta created a culture in which personal ambition and betrayal were dangerous, and where the greater good of the organization outweighed individual desires. At the same time, Luciano also used omerta as a way to maintain control over the Mafia's activities. Unlike many crime bosses who ruled through sheer force and fear, Luciano's leadership was rooted in a more cerebral, almost strategic manipulation of the code. He understood that fear could be just as powerful as loyalty, and he used the code to both inspire dedication among his followers and to establish his own unchallenged dominance. Omerta became a mechanism for controlling every aspect of Mafia life, from the rank-and-file soldiers to the powerful capos who managed major operations. If you broke the code, you broke the family, no one was safe. In many ways, omerta allowed Luciano to build his empire with a level of operational efficiency that other crime families lacked. By ensuring that there were few leaks within the organization, he could maintain a tight grip on operations, protect his assets, and ensure that all members were working toward the same goal. Luciano's belief in the code also extended beyond the Mafia itself. He knew that omerta would serve as a powerful deterrent against law enforcement. The code not only silenced the Mafia's members but also made it incredibly difficult for the authorities to build a case against him or his organization. If the government was unable to extract information, then the Mafia could continue to operate freely, its members bound by loyalty and silence. In the broader context of Luciano's reign, omerta symbolized much more than just the rules of the underworld. It was a reflection of his personality, his belief in order, control, and the need to remain in the shadows. Luciano's power was built on the bedrock of secrecy, and omerta ensured that he remained untouchable, even as his empire grew in size and influence. While the Mafia was often portrayed as a violent, lawless entity, omerta presented an image of an organization that was tightly controlled, disciplined, and highly organized. The code was as much about creating a unified front as it was about maintaining fear and power through silence. However, omerta would also prove to be the source of its eventual undoing. While it allowed Luciano to build a formidable empire, the very nature of the code, its emphasis on secrecy and its intolerance for betrayal, created an environment of paranoia and mistrust. Luciano may have used omerta to control the Mafia, but it also fostered a culture that made it difficult for any one leader to fully trust those around him, even as his empire expanded. Eventually, the very loyalty that omerta instilled would lead to cracks in the foundation of Luciano's organization, as betrayals from within the Mafia itself would contribute to his eventual downfall. Nevertheless, omerta remained the backbone of Luciano's Mafia, an idea that, despite its flaws, gave the organization its strength, its unity, and its fearsome reputation. Lucky Luciano's legacy as a transformative figure in organized crime is most clearly seen in how he revolutionized the Mafia from a loose confederation of gangsters into a sophisticated, multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. Unlike many of his predecessors who relied on chaotic street-level violence to control the underworld, Luciano recognized that organized crime could be run like a legitimate business, an insight that forever changed the structure and operations of the Mafia. To Luciano, the Mafia wasn't just a group of criminals. It was a corporation in its own right, one that needed to operate efficiently, profitably, and with as little chaos as possible. One of Luciano's key strategies was to professionalize the Mafia's activities, turning illegal operations into structured businesses that could generate consistent income. Gambling, bootlegging, drug trafficking, labor racketeering, and even prostitution became not just sources of illicit wealth but organized industries in their own right. What set Luciano apart was his ability to standardize these operations, reduce internal conflicts, and ensure that money flowed freely through every facet of his empire. While traditional Mafia bosses had run their businesses haphazardly, Luciano brought in efficiency and accountability. He understood that in order for the Mafia to survive long-term, it needed to function like any other successful business, carefully managed, well-funded, and well-protected from external threats. Gambling was perhaps one of the first criminal businesses Luciano sought to modernize. By the 1920s, gambling in the United States was a massive underground industry, and Luciano quickly saw its potential. In New York, for example, illegal gambling operations such as the numbers rackets, where bettors placed wagers on the outcomes of daily number draws, were a key part of the city's underworld. Luciano didn't just want a cut of these profits. He wanted to streamline the operation, bring in consistent, reliable revenue, and eliminate the turf wars that often led to violence and instability. He approached gambling as a business, overseeing its operations with the same attention to detail as any corporate mogul. By centralizing control over gambling, Luciano ensured that all the city's various factions benefited from the racket while reducing the internal fighting that had plagued the industry for years. Another of Luciano's most lucrative and strategic moves was his involvement in bootlegging. The Prohibition era, 1920 to 1933, was a goldmine for organized crime, as the national ban on alcohol led to a booming illegal market. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to capitalize on this opportunity, organizing the transport, distribution, and sale of alcohol on an industrial scale. He built a network of distilleries, distribution channels, and speakeasies, hidden bars where people could secretly buy and drink alcohol. But what truly set Luciano's operations apart was his ability to bring other criminal organizations into the fold, creating a nationwide bootlegging network. He made deals with rival gangs, ensuring that his business didn't face significant opposition while simultaneously cutting out inefficiencies. Luciano's vision was clear. He didn't want to control every drop of alcohol. He wanted a consistent flow of profits from the entire supply chain, from production to distribution. While gambling and bootlegging were key sources of revenue, Luciano's criminal empire also expanded into a diverse range of illegal enterprises. Labor racketeering became another critical business under Luciano's control. The Mafia had long been involved in manipulating union activities, using their influence to extort businesses and control workers. Luciano, however, took this operation to new heights. He used his connections with union leaders to orchestrate widespread extortion, forcing businesses to pay protection money in exchange for labor peace. This operation wasn't just about bullying small businesses, it was about controlling entire industries. By having Mafia-controlled unions infiltrate major sectors, construction, transport, and manufacturing, Luciano could extract huge sums of money while solidifying his influence over the city's economy. Luciano's ability to manage this vast empire of criminal enterprises was based on his deep understanding of organization and delegation. He surrounded himself with trusted lieutenants, men like Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese, who helped oversee specific aspects of the business. Lansky, in particular, was an invaluable asset to Luciano in managing finances. Known as the accountant of the Mafia, Lansky had an uncanny ability to manage vast sums of money, launder it through legitimate businesses, and invest in various operations. Lansky's financial expertise allowed Luciano to grow his operations and protect his wealth from law enforcement and competitors. Costello, on the other hand, was responsible for handling the day-to-day operations, maintaining relationships with politicians and law enforcement, and ensuring that the Mafia's interests were safeguarded from external threats. This division of labor ensured that Luciano's empire operated smoothly and efficiently, without the internal turmoil that had characterized earlier Mafia organizations. Luciano also understood the importance of integrating legitimate businesses into the Mafia's network. By buying up restaurants, clubs, and hotels, Luciano created a front for his illegal operations. These businesses acted as both a source of income and a place to launder money. As the Mafia became more deeply embedded in various sectors of society, it became increasingly difficult for law enforcement to distinguish between legitimate enterprises and criminal operations. This blurring of the lines between legal and illegal allowed Luciano to expand his influence and build a more robust empire. In essence, Luciano was not just running an underworld network. He was creating a criminal business conglomerate that could withstand the scrutiny of authorities and operate for decades. The creation of the Commission in 1931 was another pivotal moment in the development of Luciano's criminal business empire. The Commission was a council composed of the heads of the 5 major Mafia families in New York, with Luciano at its helm. The Commission's primary purpose was to act as a governing body for all Mafia activities in the United States, mediating disputes, overseeing business operations, and ensuring that all families operated in a coordinated, professional manner. This system of governance eliminated much of the violence and chaos that had previously characterized Mafia interactions. Instead of fighting for dominance, families were now able to share profits, respect each other's territories, and cooperate on large-scale ventures. Luciano's establishment of the commission was another move that solidified his place as the undisputed boss of American organized crime. He had not only created a profitable business empire, he had institutionalized it, giving it structure, governance, and stability. In addition to these traditional criminal operations, Luciano was also involved in more illicit activities, such as narcotics trafficking. As the Mafia's power and influence grew, so did its interest in drugs, particularly heroin. Luciano recognized the enormous profit potential in the narcotics trade and sought to expand into this market. By forging international connections with criminal syndicates in Europe and Asia, he was able to establish a lucrative global heroin pipeline. This move marked the Mafia's shift toward a more transnational criminal enterprise, as it sought to profit from markets beyond the United States. Luciano's ventures into narcotics provided a new stream of income for his empire, further entrenching the Mafia's hold on illegal trade across the world. Ultimately, Luciano's ability to turn organized crime into a business enterprise transformed the Mafia from a collection of disjointed factions into a cohesive, powerful force in global crime. He built a criminal empire that was as efficient, ruthless, and profitable as any legitimate corporation, one that would continue to thrive even after his fall from power. His strategic foresight, organizational skills, and business acumen enabled the Mafia to not only survive but to dominate large swathes of the American criminal underworld for decades. In many ways, Luciano set the blueprint for how organized crime would evolve in the 20th century, laying the groundwork for future generations of criminals to follow. The story of Lucky Luciano's rise to power cannot be told without examining the intricate web of allies and enemies he created along the way. In the cutthroat world of organized crime, alliances were as important as the ability to eliminate rivals. Luciano's genius lay not just in his capacity to build an empire, but in his exceptional skill at forging strategic relationships, navigating betrayals, and understanding the shifting balance of power within the Mafia. His relationships were complex and often fraught with tension, but they were integral to both his rise to power and the consolidation of his criminal empire. One of the most significant alliances in Luciano's career was with Meyer Lansky, a brilliant Jewish mobster and financier who would become one of the most trusted and valuable members of Luciano's inner circle. Lansky's business acumen was unparalleled, and he was instrumental in helping Luciano turn the Mafia into a multi-million-dollar criminal empire. While Luciano was the face of the organization, Lansky worked behind the scenes, managing the finances, laundering money, and helping to legitimize some of the Mafia's operations. Lansky's connections to powerful Jewish crime syndicates and his ability to navigate financial markets made him an invaluable partner for Luciano, especially when it came to dealing with the complexities of running large-scale criminal enterprises. The relationship between Luciano and Lansky was one of mutual respect and shared vision. They both understood the importance of creating a stable, professional criminal organization. While Luciano's focus was on consolidating power and eliminating rivals, Lansky's expertise in managing illicit profits and investments made him the perfect complement to Luciano's leadership. Together, they created a robust financial infrastructure that allowed the Mafia to operate smoothly and continue to expand. Their partnership was based on a clear understanding. Luciano would provide the muscle and strategic leadership, while Lansky would ensure the financial success of their operations. This collaboration not only strengthened Luciano's position but also helped him navigate the complex world of organized crime without the chaos that often plagued rival factions. Another critical ally of Luciano was Frank Costello, a suave and highly skilled negotiator who became a trusted confidant. Costello, known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, was a master at maintaining relationships with politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement. His connections within New York's political elite proved invaluable to Luciano as they helped shield the Mafia from government interference and legal scrutiny. Costello's diplomatic skills and his ability to broker deals with politicians ensured that the Mafia could continue operating without fear of raids or crackdowns. Costello's ability to work the political system was one of the key factors in Luciano's success. He had a network of contacts that spanned from City Hall to Washington, D.C., which made him a crucial figure in ensuring the Mafia's survival during times of increasing law enforcement pressure. In return for his loyalty, Costello was given a significant role in the organization, overseeing the day-to-day operations and managing the relationships with outside entities. His strategic mind helped Luciano stay ahead of law enforcement and ensured that the Mafia could continue to grow despite the constant threat of government action. However, the alliances that Luciano forged were not always smooth, and at times, they would become the breeding grounds for fierce rivalries and betrayal. One of the most significant and bitter rivalries was between Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, the two mafia bosses who controlled most of the power in New York before Luciano took control. Masuria was the head of the Morello crime family, a dominant faction in the city, while Maranzano led the Castellamarese clan. Both men were fiercely ambitious, and their competition for control of New York's underworld sparked the Castellamarese War in the early 1930s, a brutal conflict that would ultimately pave the way for Luciano's rise. Luciano, initially a soldier in Masuria's family, quickly realized that the ongoing war between these two factions was draining resources and threatening the stability of the Mafia. While Masuria relied on traditional Mafia tactics, violence, intimidation, and power, Luciano saw a different future. He believed that the Mafia needed to evolve, that the infighting had to stop for the organization to survive. This vision led Luciano to make a fateful decision. He betrayed Masuria and aligned himself with Maranzano, tipping the balance of power. The betrayal was calculated and cold, a move that would secure Luciano's future but forever mark him as a man willing to make difficult, ruthless choices for the sake of his ambitions. Maranzano, however, was not the ideal partner Luciano had hoped for. After coming to power, Maranzano's vision for the Mafia was rooted in the old ways, hierarchical and deeply entrenched in Sicilian traditions. He wanted to control the Mafia like a king, and this authoritarian approach clashed with Luciano's more modern, business-oriented outlook. As soon as Luciano consolidated enough power, he turned on Maranzano, orchestrating his assassination in 1931. This betrayal not only eliminated a key rival but also allowed Luciano to finally take control of the Mafia in New York. In the wake of Maranzano's death, Luciano created the Commission, a governing body that would oversee all Mafia families in America, including Maranzano's former faction, the Genovese family. This strategic move marked the beginning of Luciano's reign as the undisputed boss of the American Mafia. The commission was a critical element in Luciano's plan to transform the Mafia from a disorganized network of families into a cohesive, profit-driven organization. By centralizing authority and creating a forum for resolving disputes, Luciano ensured that there would be no more bloodshed over territory and power. In this way, the commission became the backbone of the modern Mafia, a system that provided structure and stability to what had once been a chaotic and violent underworld. But as with all great leaders, Luciano's allies were not immune to the pressures of power, and his relationship with his closest confidants was not without its challenges. Vito Genovese, a ruthless and ambitious mobster, would eventually become one of Luciano's biggest rivals. Genovese was a member of Luciano's inner circle, but over time his desire for more power and control led to tensions between the two men. Genovese's attempt to seize control of the Genovese family, one of the most powerful Mafia families in New York, created friction, and it wasn't long before Genovese was involved in plots against Luciano. His ambition and willingness to use violence to achieve his goals ultimately led to Genovese's downfall. Yet the tension between the two men was a reminder of the dangerous dynamics of the Mafia. Loyalty could quickly turn to betrayal, and even the closest of alliances could fracture under the weight of power struggles. Luciano's relationships with his allies and enemies reveal the complex, often treacherous nature of the Mafia world. His ability to read people, forge strategic alliances, and eliminate rivals made him a master manipulator. But his story also highlights the cost of such ruthlessness: the betrayals, the shifting alliances, and the constant threat of rivals who were just as ambitious and dangerous as he was. Luciano's reign was built on a delicate balance of loyalty and fear, and his success depended not only on his ability to form alliances but also on his capacity to navigate the dangerous terrain of Mafia politics. Ultimately, it was this ability to manage both his friends and enemies that allowed Luciano to build one of the most powerful and enduring criminal empires in history. Behind the public facade of power, wealth, and influence, the true nature of Lucky Luciano's reign was forged in an ongoing battle, a hidden war fought on multiple fronts. This was a war not just against law enforcement or rival gangs, but a psychological and strategic conflict within the Mafia itself. In the world Luciano navigated, there was no place for weakness and no time for complacency. It was a world of constant maneuvering, shadowy alliances, betrayals, and a relentless pursuit of power. The conflicts within the Mafia were often just as deadly and dangerous as the external threats, and Luciano's ability to outwit, outlast, and eliminate his enemies would be crucial to his success. At the heart of Luciano's hidden war was the Castellamarese War, a violent power struggle that played a pivotal role in Luciano's rise. The battle between the Morello and Castellamarese crime families was not only a battle for territory but a clash of ideologies. Joe Masuria, the boss of the Morello family, represented the old ways of Mafia rule, aggressive, violent, and authoritarian. His leadership was founded on brute strength and raw power. On the other hand, Salvatore Maranzano, leader of the Castellamarese faction, was trying to implement a more hierarchical, Sicilian-style structure that emphasized strict loyalty and obedience. Luciano, initially an ally of Masuria, found himself caught between these two worlds. He was not satisfied with Masuria's old-school approach and saw the chaos of the gang wars as detrimental to the Mafia's long-term survival. Unlike Masuria, Luciano recognized that the Mafia needed structure, organization, and professionalism. Luciano's tactical genius was in his ability to see that the ongoing infighting between the factions was unsustainable. It was a battle that was draining resources, causing unnecessary violence, and putting the entire underworld at risk of exposure to law enforcement. Luciano saw an opportunity. If he played his cards right, he could end this war and emerge as the dominant force. The war became a complex web of alliances and betrayals. Luciano made a bold move by switching sides, betraying Masuria and siding with Maranzano, believing that Maranzano's approach would be better for the future of the Mafia. This move was as much about survival as it was about strategy. Masuria, blinded by his loyalty to old methods, underestimated Luciano's ambitions and saw him as a mere foot soldier. Luciano, with his sharp mind and foresight, understood that this moment would determine the future of the Mafia in America. He aligned himself with Maranzano, securing a spot among the most powerful men in the Mafia. But Luciano wasn't just looking to survive. He was positioning himself for the next phase of his rise. Masuria's arrogance would be his downfall. In 1931, after years of bloody fighting and shifting allegiances, Luciano orchestrated Masuria's assassination in a carefully planned ambush at a restaurant in Coney Island. The assassination was swift, efficient, and symbolic of Luciano's ruthlessness. It sent a message: the old guard was dead and a new order was emerging. With Masuria out of the picture, Luciano and Maranzano had control of New York. However, Luciano knew that his partnership with Maranzano would not last. Maranzano, still adhering to the rigid old-world structure of the Mafia, quickly began to alienate key members of the Mafia, including Luciano. It was Luciano's next strategic move that truly solidified his power. In 1931, Luciano arranged for the murder of Maranzano. This act, while violent, was carefully calculated. Maranzano's rule was too authoritarian and rigid for Luciano's vision of a more modern, business-minded Mafia. By removing Maranzano, Luciano not only secured his place at the top of the Mafia but also established the Commission, a governing body that would oversee the operations of all the major Mafia families in the United States. The Commission was a stroke of genius, a strategic masterstroke that would provide the Mafia with a system of governance, reducing internal conflict and providing stability. It was a formalized power structure that allowed Luciano to reign supreme, but also ensured that rival families had a stake in the decision-making process. Yet, even as Luciano consolidated his control, the hidden war was far from over. The very success of his power structures created new challenges and enemies. Vito Genovese, a rising star in the Mafia, would become one of Luciano's most dangerous rivals. Genovese had been a loyal soldier for Luciano, but his ambition was insatiable. Genovese sought to seize control of the powerful Genovese family and, by extension, the most profitable territories in New York. He saw Luciano's leadership as an obstacle to his own rise, and he wasn't afraid to use force or treachery to get what he wanted. This conflict within Luciano's ranks was a critical test for his leadership. Genovese's rise highlighted the dangerous nature of power in the Mafia. Even the most trusted allies could quickly turn into bitter enemies, and betrayal was always lurking around the corner. Luciano's ability to manage these tensions, to keep his subordinates loyal and obedient, became increasingly important as his empire grew. Though Genovese eventually fled to Italy to avoid prosecution for his crimes, the threat he posed during the height of his ambition proved that even Luciano's most trusted lieutenants could turn against him in the brutal world of organized crime. But the hidden war wasn't just about battling enemies within the Mafia. Luciano had to contend with a growing wave of law enforcement pressure. The federal government was becoming more serious about cracking down on organized crime, and Luciano knew that the law could be as deadly as any rival. Prohibition had brought a vast flow of wealth into the hands of criminals, and law enforcement was beginning to catch on. The Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI), under J. Edgar Hoover, was actively investigating the Mafia's activities, and Luciano was a primary target. In addition to federal agents, state police and local authorities were all working to bring down the Mafia. But Luciano, always the strategist, took steps to protect himself. His connections with politicians and law enforcement officials, particularly through his trusted ally Frank Costello, provided him with the cover he needed to operate freely, even under increasing scrutiny. In the midst of these external threats, Luciano's ability to remain hidden, to avoid direct confrontation with the authorities, was key to his continued dominance. His leadership was not based solely on brute force, it was based on his ability to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies, both inside and outside the Mafia. He understood that the key to survival was adaptability and foresight, the ability to act strategically in a world where violence and betrayal were commonplace. The hidden war that Luciano waged was a battle for supremacy, not just over rivals, but over the very future of the Mafia itself. His ability to navigate the murky waters of loyalty and betrayal, to unite and divide factions as needed, ensured his place as the most powerful mob boss of his era. By removing the old guard and instituting the commission, Luciano created a system of governance that allowed the Mafia to thrive, but it was also this very system that created the seeds of future conflict. The hidden war was not just a conflict of arms, it was a battle for the soul of the Mafia, for the control of a vast empire that Luciano built on strategy, fear, and the manipulation of his allies and enemies alike. The rise of Lucky Luciano to the apex of organized crime in America was a story marked by brilliance, ruthlessness, and strategic thinking. However, even the most powerful figures eventually faced the inevitable, the fragility of their own empire. For Luciano, the seeds of his downfall were planted long before his arrest in 1936. His empire, built on manipulation, alliances, and violence, faced growing challenges that would slowly but surely unravel the carefully constructed world he had built. The fall of Luciano was not an immediate collapse. It was a gradual process that involved betrayal, changing political landscapes, and, ultimately, the law catching up with him. Luciano's downfall began as a result of both external and internal factors. Externally, the federal government had been aggressively targeting organized crime since the early 1930s. The rise of the FBI and the increasing attention on mob activities in the wake of Prohibition's end meant that the Mafia was no longer able to operate with the same level of impunity that it once did. The government had grown more organized and persistent, and despite Luciano's political connections and the protection offered by his alliances with powerful figures, law enforcement was closing in. Internally, Luciano's position was challenged by the very power structure he had created. The commission, while it served to reduce internal conflicts and consolidate the Mafia's power, also introduced new dangers. The creation of a shared leadership structure meant that the more ambitious and power-hungry figures within the Mafia could begin to challenge Luciano's supremacy. This was not lost on Vito Genovese, a trusted lieutenant of Luciano, who began to grow increasingly dissatisfied with his position in the Mafia hierarchy. Genovese, who had once been a loyal ally, became an active threat, plotting behind Luciano's back to consolidate his own power. It was clear that the loyalty that had initially helped Luciano build his empire was beginning to erode. Trust became an increasingly fragile commodity in the underworld, and betrayals were common, especially when the stakes were so high. Luciano's downfall was not a sudden event but the culmination of years of careful maneuvering by his enemies, both within the Mafia and beyond. The turning point came in 1936 when Luciano was targeted by law enforcement in what would be a decisive blow to his empire. Luciano's criminal operations, spanning gambling, bootlegging, and narcotics trafficking, were no longer operating in the shadows. They had grown too large and too visible. The wealth and influence that Luciano had amassed, which had once protected him, now became a liability. His widespread empire made him a prime target for the government, and his connection to so many illicit enterprises made him vulnerable to prosecution. Luciano's arrest came as the result of an extensive investigation led by Thomas E. Dewey, a young and ambitious prosecutor who was determined to bring down organized crime. Dewey had been steadily building a case against Luciano, focusing on his involvement in vice rackets and his ability to evade the law. It was clear to Dewey that Luciano was the mastermind behind the entire network of criminal enterprises, and he was willing to use every legal tool at his disposal to take him down. The investigation was relentless, and Luciano, who had once been able to operate under the radar, now found himself ensnared in a massive legal web. Despite his best efforts to manipulate and evade, Luciano could not outmaneuver Dewey and his team. In 1936, Luciano was finally arrested on charges of compelling women into prostitution and running a nationwide prostitution ring. Though the charges were somewhat tangential to the heart of Luciano's criminal empire, they provided the basis for his conviction. The case was meticulously built, and it was clear that Luciano's connections and power could not protect him any longer. In a very public trial, Luciano was found guilty and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. His fall from power was swift and unforgiving. For Luciano, the trial was a devastating blow, not only because of the loss of his freedom but because it represented a stark moment of vulnerability in a life that had been marked by control and invincibility. His carefully cultivated persona as an untouchable mob boss was shattered. He had always been the one pulling the strings, the one who could make others bend to his will. Yet, in that courtroom he was just another criminal who had been caught in the machinery of justice. The very system he had worked so hard to avoid had finally caught up with him. But even in defeat, Luciano's mind remained sharp. His fall from grace did not mark the end of his influence over the Mafia. Rather, it represented a new phase in which he would continue to wield power from behind bars. The power he had accumulated had been based on the foundation of his relationships and his network. Even though he was incarcerated, Luciano still had allies and connections within the Mafia. The loyalty he had forged over the years, both through fear and mutual benefit, did not vanish with his arrest. Luciano was able to continue controlling the day-to-day operations of his criminal empire even from prison. In fact, his ability to manage from behind bars would demonstrate the remarkable extent of his power and the Mafia's ability to operate without the direct presence of its leader. Despite his continued influence, Luciano's arrest signaled the beginning of the end for his empire. The Mafia was undergoing a transition, and the political and criminal landscape of the United States was changing. His empire was not as unassailable as it once had been. Internal rifts began to form, with rival factions trying to claim power, and law enforcement became more aggressive in its pursuit of organized crime figures. Luciano, once the most powerful and innovative mob boss in American history, found himself slowly losing control as new criminal leaders emerged and the Mafia was forced to adapt to the changing political environment. But the emotional impact of his fall was profound. For a man who had built his empire on the foundations of loyalty, secrecy, and control, the betrayal of his own people, the loss of his freedom, and the media frenzy surrounding his arrest marked a critical juncture in his life. Luciano had always thrived in the shadows, playing a game of power and manipulation. But in prison he was forced to face the consequences of his actions. His fall was not just the loss of his empire but also a personal reckoning for the man who had once believed that no one could ever touch him. Luciano's downfall was a sobering reminder of the cyclical nature of power in the criminal underworld. It was a world built on betrayal, loyalty, and the shifting sands of alliances. No one, no matter how powerful, was immune to the forces of time, change, and ambition. Even as Luciano sat in prison, plotting and managing his affairs, he had already lost the most important thing: his position at the top. His fall marked the end of an era, and the beginning of a new chapter in the Mafia's story, one that would inevitably evolve beyond Luciano's vision. His arrest and subsequent conviction signaled the end of Luciano's reign as the undisputed king of the Mafia. Though he continued to exert influence from behind bars, his fall marked the beginning of the unraveling of the world he had so carefully constructed. The empire that had once been a testament to his brilliance, his strategic mind, and his sheer ruthlessness was now in decline, and the forces that brought it down were only beginning to take shape. Lucky Luciano's arrest in 1936 was the culmination of years of relentless investigation, strategic betrayals, and political maneuvering that brought down one of the most powerful figures in organized crime. However, it was during the trial that Luciano's life took a dramatic turn from the world of shadows and unchallenged rule to the stark reality of legal proceedings, public scrutiny, and the inevitable consequences of his empire building. The trial was more than just a courtroom battle. It was an emotional and psychological turning point for Luciano. It represented not just the collapse of his criminal empire but also the unraveling of his persona as the invincible Don, the untouchable kingpin who had maneuvered through life with unparalleled control. The charges against Luciano were not new to him. He had long known that his criminal operations, ranging from bootlegging and gambling to prostitution and narcotics, made him a prime target for law enforcement. But Luciano's ability to keep his empire hidden and protected from prosecution had, until now, made him almost invincible. He had survived numerous close calls, worked his network of political and law enforcement connections to avoid the law, and most importantly, maintained the loyalty of his allies. However, the case against him was different. This time there would be no easy escape, no simple manipulation of the system. The charges brought against him were rooted in organized crime's most visible and controversial aspect: prostitution, specifically his role in running a large-scale prostitution ring and compelling women into the business. The mastermind behind his arrest was Thomas E. Dewey, the ambitious and determined New York prosecutor who had spent years building his case against Luciano and other mafia figures. Dewey was relentless in his pursuit of organized crime, and his goal was clear: to bring down the mafia, starting with the most powerful figure in the underworld. Dewey's work was thorough and methodical. He spent years gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and infiltrating Luciano's operations. The case was built carefully, with every detail examined and presented to ensure Luciano's conviction. The trial, held in 1936, was a spectacle. The courtroom was filled with reporters, photographers, and spectators, all eager to witness the fall of the most famous crime boss in America. For Luciano, this trial represented a profound shift from the shadows where he had thrived to the harsh glare of public attention. Until this point, Luciano had carefully cultivated a public image that straddled the line between criminal genius and respected businessman. He had kept a low profile when it came to his personal life, allowing his criminal activities to remain hidden behind the layers of legitimate business dealings and his network of influential allies. But now, every detail of his criminal empire was being exposed. His personal life was dissected, his relationships with his allies and enemies brought into the light, and his every move scrutinized. Despite his status and the wealth he had accumulated, Luciano found himself sitting in the defendant's chair as a criminal, a man stripped of the power and control he had once wielded. The prosecution portrayed him as the head of a massive criminal network, the puppet master behind an array of illegal activities that spanned the nation. They presented a damning case, highlighting the vast reach of Luciano's operations and the iron grip he held over his associates. Dewey and his team were adept at connecting the dots, showing that Luciano was not just involved in isolated crimes, but was the central figure in a far-reaching syndicate. The witnesses who testified against him, many of them former associates or women who had been coerced into prostitution, painted a picture of a man who was both charismatic and merciless, capable of inspiring loyalty and fear in equal measure. For Luciano, the emotional toll of the trial was immense. He had spent his life building an empire where he controlled everything from the streets of New York to the mafia families across the country. Yet, in that courtroom he was powerless. The tables had turned, and Luciano, the mastermind who had orchestrated betrayals and power plays with ease, found himself on the receiving end of the system he had long manipulated. There was no way to control the jury, no way to intimidate the prosecutor, and no way to make the charges disappear. He was facing not just the loss of his freedom, but the public unraveling of the very legacy he had worked so hard to build. During the trial, Luciano remained calm and composed, never showing signs of fear or panic. This was, after all, a man who had always relied on his ability to keep his emotions in check, to outthink his adversaries, and to maintain control of any situation. Yet the trial was different. For the first time he was caught in a system he couldn't manipulate, and he was forced to confront the reality of the empire he had built, not as a criminal mastermind but as a convicted felon facing the full force of the law. The verdict was inevitable. In 1936, Luciano was found guilty of running a prostitution ring, and he was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. For a man who had spent his life at the top of the mafia, controlling vast wealth and power, the sentence was a devastating blow. The public reaction to his conviction was one of mixed emotions. On one hand, there was a sense of justice being served. The mafia had been brought to heel, and one of its most notorious figures had finally been caught. On the other hand, there was an almost mythic sense of loss. Luciano had become a symbol of the mafia's golden age, a representation of power and cunning. His conviction marked the end of an era for both the criminal underworld and the public's fascination with the figure of the mob boss. For Luciano, the sentence was not just a personal blow but a deep psychological shift. He had been, for most of his life, untouchable, above the law, the orchestrator of an empire that stretched across the United States. Now he was a prisoner, his power reduced to the walls of a penitentiary. It was a jarring reality for a man who had built his entire life around the concept of control. His empire was crumbling and he was powerless to stop it. But even in prison, Luciano's mind remained sharp. He understood that his story was not over, it was simply entering a new phase. While his body would be confined, his influence would not be so easily contained. This moment, the trial and the sentence, marked the beginning of Luciano's shift from the king of the criminal world to a prisoner who continued to pull the strings from behind bars. While his conviction was the end of his visible reign, it was not the end of his power. In many ways, his legacy continued to shape the Mafia, even as he served time in prison. The trial, though devastating, became a defining chapter in the life of a man who had lived by his wits, his alliances, and his ruthlessness. Despite being brought down by the law, Luciano's ability to continue influencing the underworld, even from his cell, would cement his place in history as one of the most iconic and enduring figures of the Mafia era. Even in the confines of a prison cell, where walls and bars were supposed to strip a man of his power, Lucky Luciano proved that his control over the Mafia was not easily severed. His ability to influence and manage his vast criminal empire from behind bars is one of the most remarkable aspects of his legacy, and it demonstrates the depth of his strategic genius. Luciano's time in prison was far from a period of isolation and defeat. Instead, it marked a shift in how he wielded power, as he adapted to his new circumstances with the same meticulous planning and foresight that had guided his rise to the top of the criminal underworld. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in 1936, but this did not signal the end of his influence over the Mafia. In fact, it was just the beginning of a new phase in his leadership. After his conviction, he was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, where he would spend the next several years. But even within the prison system, Luciano found ways to maintain a grip on his empire. His network of loyalists, forged over decades of manipulation and strategic alliances, continued to operate under his command. These connections, established during his years at the helm of the Mafia, allowed him to continue overseeing operations, influencing decisions, and even directing activities from his prison cell. Luciano's ability to maintain his power from behind bars was partly due to his influence within the Mafia, where loyalty and obedience were valued above all else. He had spent years cultivating relationships with key figures, capos, lieutenants, and influential mobsters, who were not only loyal to him but saw him as the true leader of the Mafia. Even though he was incarcerated, these men continued to respect him, obeying his orders as though he were still free. Through them, Luciano was able to communicate directly with the outside world, using intermediaries and trusted messengers to relay his commands. His network, made up of both high-ranking Mafia members and key operatives across the United States, ensured that Luciano's influence continued to be felt in the underworld. This system of communication, though covert, was highly effective. Luciano had been a master of secrecy and subtlety throughout his career, and prison did not change that. He made use of every tool at his disposal, from prison staff to visitors, to maintain a flow of information. His ties to Frank Costello, one of his most trusted allies, were instrumental in this process. Costello, known for his ability to navigate the political world and his connections within law enforcement, became the key intermediary between Luciano and the outside world. Through Costello, Luciano was able to stay informed about developments in the Mafia and the state of his empire. Costello was also instrumental in keeping Luciano's interests protected, ensuring that rival factions within the Mafia did not exploit his incarceration to undermine his authority. Even from prison, Luciano continued to make important decisions that shaped the direction of the Mafia. He maintained a level of control over rackets, including gambling, labor racketeering, and drug trafficking, which were still generating massive profits. These enterprises were run by loyal underbosses and capos who, while technically independent, deferred to Luciano's leadership. It was clear that Luciano's power extended far beyond the prison walls. He continued to be the central figure in the Mafia's operations, a figure whose mere name commanded respect and loyalty. Luciano's power was also maintained by his ongoing relationships with politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement officials. His political connections, carefully cultivated over the years, proved invaluable in helping him maintain his grip on power. His relationships with political figures and law enforcement officers were not severed by his imprisonment. Instead, Luciano continued to use his influence to protect the Mafia's interests. His ability to leverage his connections to navigate the challenges of prison life, and the legal and political obstacles that arose in the wake of his conviction, allowed him to retain significant sway over the Mafia's direction. Moreover, Luciano's prison life was marked by his ability to adapt to the environment in ways that reinforced his authority. While many incarcerated individuals struggle with the loss of their freedom and the humiliations of prison life, Luciano turned his situation into a strategic advantage. He built relationships with other inmates, some of whom were powerful figures in their own right. By establishing alliances with fellow criminals, prison officials, and even guards, Luciano was able to create an environment where his authority was respected. His charisma and reputation worked in his favor, and he quickly became a central figure within the prison's social structure. In many ways, he was able to turn the prison into just another extension of the criminal empire he had once run from the streets of New York. While Luciano was behind bars, his influence continued to grow. In the late 1940s, he was granted a form of house arrest, a move that was both a sign of his enduring influence and a reflection of his manipulative abilities. The decision to place him in a less restrictive environment was made, in part, because of the immense pressure from Luciano's supporters, who used their political connections to argue for his release. Additionally, Luciano's health had begun to deteriorate, and his medical needs were used as a justification for his relocation to a more comfortable living arrangement. But this shift was also a direct result of his unrelenting influence within both the Mafia and the political world. It showed that even from prison, Luciano had the power to manipulate the system to his advantage. However, even as Luciano managed to retain his power from behind bars, there were challenges to his leadership. The Mafia, like any organization, was always vulnerable to internal conflict, and Luciano's long absence allowed other figures to rise to prominence. Vito Genovese, once one of his closest allies, began to challenge his authority. Genovese sought to position himself as the new boss of the Mafia, leveraging Luciano's imprisonment to consolidate power within the Genovese family and beyond. While Luciano's loyalists resisted Genovese's rise, the growing divisions within the Mafia marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which Luciano's once uncontested authority was slowly being eroded. Despite these challenges, Luciano's continued control over the Mafia from prison served as a testament to his extraordinary leadership and strategic genius. He had constructed an empire that was so deeply entrenched in American society, spanning illicit activities, political influence, and social networks, that it couldn't be easily dismantled, even by the most powerful forces in law enforcement. Luciano's prison years, though marked by the loss of his physical freedom, showed that his true power lay not in the streets or in the boardrooms but in his ability to control people, manipulate systems, and adapt to his environment. Luciano's power behind bars is one of the most fascinating aspects of his criminal career. It was a period that demonstrated his unparalleled ability to maintain influence and authority despite being physically confined. His network remained loyal, and his decision-making continued to shape the direction of the Mafia, making him one of the most formidable figures in organized crime history, one whose shadow still looms over the criminal world even today. Lucky Luciano's exile to Italy in 1946 marked a new chapter in his life, one that was as complex and paradoxical as his earlier years at the height of his power. After being granted a reprieve from his prison sentence, Luciano found himself back in his homeland, a place he had left as a young immigrant. Though no longer at the helm of the American Mafia, Luciano's name still carried immense weight, and his reputation continued to echo through the criminal underworld. In Italy, Luciano struggled to regain the same level of influence he had once enjoyed in the United States. The Mafia in Italy was different, more fragmented and less centralized than the organized syndicate Luciano had created in America. Local mob bosses were wary of a foreigner like Luciano trying to impose his brand of order on their turf. Still, Luciano remained an influential figure in the world of organized crime, though his direct control over the American Mafia had diminished. His ties to his loyalists, especially Meyer Lansky and other Mafia figures in the U.S., kept him informed about the operations even from across the ocean. However, Luciano's final years were also marked by physical decline and disillusionment. He no longer had the same vigor that once fueled his criminal empire, and he faced the reality of his own mortality. Living quietly in Naples, he found himself far removed from the glory of his previous life. Yet even in this diminished state, Luciano's legacy continued to influence both the Mafia and the broader world of organized crime, as future generations of criminals looked to him as a model of strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. Luciano died in 1962, a man who had once ruled the criminal underworld, now living out his final days in quiet reflection. His exile and death signified the end of an era, but the systems he created within the Mafia continued to endure. Lucky Luciano's legacy is one of profound transformation in the world of organized crime. He redefined the Mafia from a chaotic collection of street gangs into a sophisticated, profitable enterprise. His creation of the Commission in 1931 established a formal structure for the Mafia, reducing internal conflict and enabling the families to work together efficiently. This shift to a more professional, business-like organization laid the foundation for the Mafia's continued dominance in the post-war years. Luciano's legacy also lies in his philosophy of power. He understood that influence was built not just on violence but on loyalty, manipulation, and strategic alliances. By balancing brutality with subtlety, he was able to command respect without the need for constant warfare. His ability to run a complex network of illegal businesses, gambling, bootlegging, narcotics, and labor racketeering, revolutionized the way criminal enterprises operated, bringing order and profitability to what had been a chaotic underworld. Despite his fall from power, Luciano's influence persisted. His network, built on loyalty and fear, continued to shape the Mafia's operations long after his exile. Even while living in Italy, Luciano remained a figurehead, his legacy intact through the men who continued to follow his methods. However, Luciano's legacy is also marked by contradictions. While he built an empire based on loyalty, his rise to power was fueled by betrayal, and his methods often led to moral compromises. Nonetheless, his strategic brilliance in organizing the Mafia ensured that his influence endured. Luciano remains an enduring symbol of the golden age of the Mafia, a man whose story continues to captivate and inspire both the criminal world and popular culture. His impact on organized crime is still felt today. The story of Lucky Luciano is a testament to the complex nature of power, ambition, and the human desire for control. From his humble beginnings in New York to becoming the architect of the modern Mafia, Luciano's life offers a fascinating journey through the highs and lows of criminal leadership. His ability to adapt, strategize, and outmaneuver rivals made him a figure of legend, but his eventual fall from power reminds us that even the greatest empires, built on loyalty and fear, are vulnerable to time and betrayal. Luciano's legacy, however, is not just a tale of a mob boss. It's the story of a man who redefined the criminal world, turning chaos into structure and making the Mafia a global force. His creation of the Commission and his methods of governance shaped how criminal organizations would operate for generations. While his reign was marked by ruthless ambition, it also brought order and stability to a fragmented underworld. In his final years, exiled and far from the empire he once ruled, Luciano became a symbol of both the rise and fall of power. The distance between his myth and the reality of his life in prison and exile serves as a cautionary tale, one that highlights the fragility of even the most successful criminal enterprises. His reign may have ended, but his influence remained, continuing to shape both the Mafia and the broader landscape of organized crime. Ultimately, Luciano's life and legacy remain a paradox, a brilliant strategist whose rise to power was marked by betrayal, and whose fall was a quiet reminder that no one is ever truly untouchable. His myth lives on, a part of the complex and enduring history of the Mafia and the criminal world he shaped.